Good day, everyone, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. We're excited to have you here. Our topic today is DevOps for Database, a great topic. My name is Mitch Ashley, and I'm happy to serve as your host and moderator for our panel. A few housekeeping things you'd like to take care of. Our webinar, of course, is being recorded, and we'll be happy to provide the webinar as well as an ebook to everyone who is online with us today. So you'll receive an email or you'll be able to download that from the DevOps.com website. Also, we have a panel discussion, so you're not going to have to endure a lot of slideware. This is all discussion, so we would love questions from our audience, and I know all of our speakers love questions too. So please enter your questions into the questions panel of the GoToWebinar software. So let's move on to our topic now. DevOps for Database. It's my pleasure to introduce our three panelists. First is Matt Moss, who is Product Manager of Query Search, and Matt's expertise is in implementing automated data validation and performance engineering. Next, we have Sanjay Kala, who's Director of Product at DataCall, and Sanjay brings a thorough understanding of database as well as modern software engineering tools as well as methodologies. Last but not least, we have Justin McCarthy, co-founder and CTO of StrongDM. Justin spent his career building highly scalable software and, of course, database authentication. So let's get started. I'd like to begin by having each of our panelists give us a little bit of information, kind of their perspective to set the tone for the conversation. Tell us a little bit about how you feel the state of database is within the world of DevOps today. Sanjay, would you start us out?
Sure. So, when we think about databases, it's often probably the last thing that people have brought into kind of the DevOps fold. We see this a lot at DataCall. We're a tool that helps with what we call database release automation. But my take on this field is it's a nascent field. It's one that's kind of up and coming, and it's a problem that people are running into more and more often. Certainly the conversation that we get at the trade shows we go to, people, a few years back couldn't really even identify what the problem. Today you go to whether it's, Jenkins World or DevOps World or DevOps, Enterprise Summit, you're often able to have conversations with people that more than acknowledge the problem, but are curious about, hey, how do you solve it, and kind of going that step beyond. But what you find is that most people have not actually solved this. And so it's at a place where a lot of the other elements of the software stack have been automated, have been brought into a CI/CD process, have kind of the visibility and governance. And now the focus and attention of a lot of places is turning to the database. But it's a particularly hard problem because it's stateful, unlike so many of these other things. That's a quick lay of where the land is, at least from our point of view.
Great, Justin. How about would you jump in next?
Sure. So I think I've also got to use the word nascent because, of course, I think now. So it's 2019. I think many folks out there do have a pretty good feel for what a DevOps workflow feels like, what a deployment feels like for code. And I think a lot of folks have also had the feeling of not being able to achieve some of those same behaviors at the database layer yet. I think it's also an interesting time to be turning our attention to this problem, just because in this moment we have sort of two dimensions of new problem that are only growing, and those new problems are we have an increasing diversity in basically types of database. And then, of course, we also have, I would say, an increasing global focus and attention on privacy and security, right? So the handling of that data, who gets to handle it, has also become a major topic, I'm sure, in every team. So I think we're at a great moment to be tackling this problem, but it is for sure feels unsolved.
Security, access control, privacy, all great topics. Yeah, I have to apologize for Finn, the database dog, barking there, but he's part of our mascot today on the webinar. So, Matt, would you like to go next?
Sure. I'm going to sound like a broken record. I completely agree with Justin and Sanjay. Database DevOps is still very early in its implementation. Many teams have a lot of fear of implementing any automated process when it comes to their databases, just due to the risks of loss. According to the State of DevOps database for 2019, only about 34% of groups are actually implementing automation as part of their build and deploy process when it comes to their databases themselves. So I think we're in a perfect state to really push forward and push DevOps on the database side, because there's plenty of tool sets out there that really can enable teams to automate that entire process in a safe manner that puts proper security in place, proper testing in place, and proper source control management in place.
Very good. I think all three of you kind of touched on aspects of this, but let's dive a little bit deeper. Given the state of where we are, maybe database isn't part of DevOps, or it's just kind of at those beginning stages. You know, from your perspective, you're coming at it from the database world, probably, maybe both dev and database. What are the things we need to take forward if you're just getting started, or maybe you've already begun to introduce database and DevOps together? What do we do to have to make that real, actualize it?
Go for it.
I think that, you know, one of the main challenges is to break down that separation between the development teams, the security teams, the testing teams, and the DBAs themselves. Right now, there is still a huge firewall between different groups. And in order to move forward, we need to set expectations on what DevOps can bring to the table. The benefits that DevOps can provide teams as well as provide the overall organization. I think that is really one of the main goals and things that need to be overcome really early on in order to move forward with a proper DevOps process for databases themselves.
Great. How about Sanjay? You want to jump in?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I'll pile on to that. I think kind of eliminating silos is a pretty important thing. But you know, I think there is another corollary to all of this, and it's the journey that you know, all of these application teams had to take when kind of agile and DevOps, or really just the agile movement was in its early days. I feel like there was a lot of growth that these application teams had to go through to kind of get to where they are. And in many ways, I think that the database teams are kind of having to go through a similar journey, or really entire organizations are having to go through similar journeys. And I think a lot of that starts with some of the basics, just being able to track, version, deploy, have a level of kind of visibility into these changes that are moving through the system. You know, being able to answer really basic questions like, what is the change? Who's making it? Why are they making it? Where has it been made? You know, the kind of stuff that source code control was able to answer for quite a bit of app code. But I think some of the problems are more challenging on the database side, because you know, just because you checked a script into source code control, a database script, doesn't mean that that's actually exactly how it was deployed to a number of different environments without teams having a lot of discipline. So I think, you know, the really difficult piece, the big next step that a lot of organizations have to take is have the discipline to drive a consistency in their process and methodology, and not have, you know, the hero DBA, or have that out of band, you know, I'm gonna make a fix and track it in an Excel spreadsheet and over email that you see today. And so I think that's really the kind of the big next step for a lot of organizations.
Thank you, Sanjay. Matt, do we still have you to go? Is that correct?
I think maybe you might have me to go.
Okay, Justin, great. Jump in there. Thanks.
All right, so what I do, what I've certainly done on our team, and really anytime I get a chance to talk to anybody on this topic, my get started recommendation is to just create space, and really what I mean is create budget. But just because the B word is sometimes you don't maybe make as much progress if you use that B word first. Think about it as creating space, and what I mean is space to practice some of these techniques. So a way that you can try to aspire to that same feeling you get and that same result you achieve when you apply your immutable infrastructure over here in your Terraform, or maybe you run your Chef and it feels good and it's all working great. Just ask yourself what tools and practices can we as a team create to achieve some of those same outcomes on the database side. And then I'll also say that simultaneously that forces you to acknowledge that checking in a new recipe or checking in a little bit of Terraform code is not the same on the database side, because you're dealing in much larger objects. And so committing it to your Git repo just isn't quite the same. Getting the whole team to grapple with that, so that I'm not looking at one member of the team and saying, "Why aren't you done yet?" When really just the physics and the size of their problem is so much bigger, because it implies moving around, a terabyte of important data. And so getting the space so that the whole team feels ownership over the problem, and the whole team is involved in designing some of the practices to address the problem.
Well, let's kind of take two paths here. And I definitely want to talk about the technology side of it, of course, which is extremely important. There's also the people side of it. So let me preface this by saying, at one time in my career, I was a developer. Another time I was a DBA, so I've kind of worn both hats. But in some organizations, the DBAs kind of keep control, heavy control of the database, the schema, scripts, et cetera. Other places, it's, often developers are doing that, like in a startup environment. Let me ask, from a database perspective, do DBAs, do database engineers want this to happen? Do they want to be more integrated, maybe even release some of the control that they might have over the database, or is that feasible? How about Matt? Why don't you jump in?
I definitely think DBAs love to relinquish some of the controls and reins from their database deployment process. Right now, you have DBAs spending nights and weekends to support deployment processes, and then going back and manually validating that everything is correct. By treating them as part of the process early, they not only know what scripts are being implemented, but they can really focus on their core competency, which is putting better performance and optimizing the actual changes that are occurring, ensuring compliance is actually happening when you're dealing with foreign key constraints or any manipulation to the tables themselves, and also ensuring that proper testing is being done before that item gets pushed to, say, production. Because usually it's one of those things where all of the changes build up on the development side and then get thrown over to the DBAs really late in the game. If they're more involved earlier on, it's a much better process. So I definitely think they're more willing to get on board, especially when they see the different benefits that are available by implementing DevOps overall.
Okay, good. Justin?
Sure. So what I would say is that in our experience, we work with a lot of companies that already have, I would say, substantially advanced DevOps in place. And I think one trend that certainly I notice every day is when you look at the careers page on essentially any company that has a pretty good story in place already, that acronym DBA actually probably doesn't appear anymore. Right. So like that role has already morphed and has already been transmuted into something else. And so within the DevOps umbrella, the same questions of how do I express a change? How do I recover from a failure? How do I audit the use of data? All of those activities are being performed, but they're just may not be performed by one person or one role. They've been sort of broken up, and it's still being accomplished. It's being accomplished by multiple people. So I would say that's one way to involve DBAs early is to really break down the distinction, maybe even at the title level.
Interesting. Sanjay, is that your experience too? Are you seeing kind of the DBA title label going away and in place of other approaches that are more collaborative, if you will?
It certainly has happened at some of the places that we serve. I mean, what's interesting is, on the Datical side, we have customers who kind of span the gamut. Some where, databases are still kind of managed by a shared services organization. You have all these DBAs, and I'd agree that, some of the challenges for them are, they often don't get involved early enough in some of the design process. It's someone kind of lobbing a request over pretty late in the game with very little context, and so that doesn't set anyone to succeed. And so a lot of what you see is kind of culture shift to pull DBAs in. You kind of there's now a new phrase in some of these places called the app DBA, so embedding DBAs onto application teams to help with some of that. Some of the fear and resistance comes from, well, if we're not going to be the ones making, database changes, these application developers, maybe they're great at Java or whatever it is, but they're not so great at making database changes. They're going to make lots of mistakes and whatnot. So again, it's these processes to help build some amount of like competence and oversight and kind of effectively train application development teams to be more and more in charge of it. Embedding DBAs onto these teams, a la application DBAs, is one part of it. Certainly, on the other end of the spectrum, I'd agree with Justin. There are shops out there where that DBA title doesn't really exist, right? They've kind of gone the full run out to you build it, you run it, and having really an ops mindset, like you checked in code, you developed it, you built it. Well, guess what? You're operating it too. You're gonna run that thing in prod, and if anything goes wrong, it's you. And at that point, kind of the entire team has this shared ownership over every layer of the software. But not all teams work that way, and in some places it might not even necessarily be feasible. You have these gigantic legacy data stores that sit underneath dozens upon dozens of apps, and there what you're seeing is kind of these major efforts, much of it architectural, to try to break some of that up, right? To the extent that you have a giant monolith of a database service that sits under like 20 of your apps, it's gonna be really hard to do some of these things. And so I think about it less as terms of like, getting DBAs on board with like this DevOps movement. I think there's certainly interest, right? I don't think anyone is excited about being up at 2 a.m. on a Saturday, crossing your fingers and hoping that it doesn't all go poorly. And so I think, it's less about resistance to this movement and more about getting there, but without, the massive data loss or security breaches or what have you, right? So it's one part culture, it's one part process, it's one part tooling to get people there. And certainly, I think in the most evolved stages, you see the role itself morph quite a bit, and you see that the role that everyone's playing on the team change quite a bit. But there are some intermediary stops along the way, like the whole app DBA role, where you're embedding DBAs onto app teams.
I'm curious, do any of the three of you deal with more legacy kind of applications from a database world or more new apps? Because one of our listeners, Paul, asked the question about, did the answers change depending on the platform, like a mainframe? But I think it applies to legacy versus new apps. Who wants to jump in?
At least from my experience, DevOps, when you start going to those more legacy platforms, you don't hear it being brought up as often. Teams are not looking to innovate those platforms. They're keeping them around because they're critical components in their infrastructure and they just don't have the capital or the expertise to replace them out. So we don't see them very often mentioning that DevOps is an avenue they want to go down for those particular systems. It's not to say that that is, completely out of the realm of possibilities for these organizations. Just in my experience, I haven't seen it very often where a legacy platform such as a mainframe would be integrated into more DevOps pipeline. On the ETL side, they definitely have more integrations as you're having that constant data flow. And we definitely see a lot of teams ripping data out of mainframes with a more DevOps-based process.
Mm-hmm. I would imagine the structures can be very complex and the legacy application's been around for several generations.
Oh,
Anyone
yes.
else thoughts on that? Yeah, Matt.
Well,
I would offer that one of the essential inputs to getting good at DevOps is being able to dev it, and so part of what that means is being able to actually have a version running on your workstation. And it's harder to have a version to a greater extent. Some of the older systems are bound to the hardware, right? So so they're just, if you can't virtualize it easily or containerize it or wipe it and do it again, as is the case with some old processor architectures, then it's going to be tricky. So I would echo. I observe there's a little bit of a vintage break where sort of these ideas apply forward of some vintage.
Great. Sanjay, you want to jump in, or have we covered this pretty well?
Well, I was going to say, it's funny, while I wouldn't disagree that newer apps, especially greenfield apps that are, going to be deployed just purely in the cloud, and they're going to have a microservices architecture, and they're going to do all the cool things with all the buzzwords. There's a tremendous emphasis on, we got to really figure out how to automate any changes to data stores. They might not even be relational data stores, but we're going to build it into a pipeline, and we're going to have kind of a more standard process across the entire software stack. There's much more of a, I'll call it, emphasis and push for newer apps in that way. But I'd say a lot of the customers that we work with, there is a desire to bring a lot of these same practices even down to pretty legacy data stores. We were pushed on the Datical side by a number of our customers and ended up finally adding support for DB2 on ZOS a couple years back, and there are quite a few people who use it, and you're thinking, wow, we're a DevOps tool for databases, and here we are with a client base or a customer base that's kind of pushed us into supporting DB2 on ZOS. And I think, people use that capability. To me, what it really screams is, yeah, there is an appetite kind of regardless. And even if, your process for a mainframe might not be as smooth as, that Aurora Postgres database that you have, you can still make some headway in terms of the basics of just what are the changes, who's making them, where are they making them, why are they making them, and kind of just having some of that visibility and governance and kind of, take the first step on that journey. You might not get to full-blown lights out, automated validation of every last build being done even locally on a dev machine, because it's impossible to, virtualize ZOS on a laptop. But you can do some things to at least validate some of these changes, to track them, to version them, to deploy them, and kind of incrementally be a whole lot, or not just incrementally, just process-wise, be a whole lot closer. So I do see that that there is this appetite, even if the process might end up looking slightly differently.
Okay, very good. Well, let's jump into some of the process and tool pieces of this. One of our listeners, Karan, has asked, how do you implement database change automation in DevOps? So change control along with the DevOps tool chain. Not an easy task, because databases tend to be stateful. Applications are being built so they aren't. And of course, DevOps environment is very flexible and can be rebuilt at any time based on version control, whatever. So how do you do that? How do you approach it?
So I can take a quick stab at this. Would love to kind of hear what other people have to say. There are really kind of two schools of thought when it comes to kind of thinking about database changes. I think there's been more literature and focus on this in more recent years. But basically, kind of one school of thought is what I'll call, declarative or state-based. So, this is actually the way that some of the other infrastructure code is managed. So if you think about things like Kubernetes, it is very declarative, where you call out, you declare the state that you want. In the database land, these tools will do a comparison or a diff between this ideal state, this declared state, versus whatever your target environment is. They will generate a set of migration scripts to make your target environment look like the declared state. Off you go. And so your first class citizen becomes the state declaration. It's very, for people that are kind of more, I'll call it, old school is not the right word, but if you come from a data modeling background, you're using Irwin or ER Studio.
Database is classic. We call that database classic.
Classic, there we go. I like that. So if you're going at this with kind of more of the classic tool set or whatnot, then you're starting on the modeling side, and you actually are starting with these kind of state definitions. And often it's a tool or a DBA or someone who's like, how do I make the target environment look like the state model? And of course, Irwin and ER Studio have these diff and comparison capabilities. There are so many tools out there that do it, but they're very risky in the sense that they can be wrong, and if they're wrong, it's kind of disastrous. And so they require quite a bit of oversight. They're also not very DevOps friendly in the sense that you're doing this comparison between, ideal state and target state. And so you end up doing a comparison every single time. So even when you're going to production, you're doing a comparison. And so that generated code, you haven't validated that it's run well in other places. So there is that risk. You're not working with an immutable artifact anymore when you're doing this code deployment. And it doesn't promote small incremental changes. It's not great from a rework point of view. There are all these issues, but it has some positives, which is you can check into something like source code control, or from a change control point of view, you're like, okay, at least I know what the state I'm starting at is. I know what the state I'm ending at is. And so if I have to troubleshoot or debug, it becomes very easy to be like, well, what is that table supposed to look like? Or, what is that trigger supposed to look like? You can answer these questions pretty easily, even though how those changes are made really doesn't fit well from a DevOps point of view. It's not small incremental changes. It's not an immutable artifact. Rework is a lot more complicated. You just end up regenerating a new, comparison. So anyway, that's one school of thought. The second school of thought is the imperative or migration-based approach. And you'll hear a lot of people talking about DevOps, promote this as kind of the way to tackle database change control in a kind of agile DevOps fashion, whether it's Martin Fowler and the stuff he's written on evolutionary database design, whether it's a lot of the tools, especially open source projects around database change management, written by developers for developers. They're all migration based. The idea being you author these migrations, and in fact, honestly, you could even start with some type of a state-based approach, take that output, and then like decompose it down into these migrations. But the core idea being, at this point, you're not storing that kind of state definition. You have this set of migration scripts. They're in a specific order. They can be atomic, and you can create an immutable artifact out of them, and off you go. The only issue is, at some of these really large shops that are still kind of getting comfortable with small incremental changes and whatnot, you end up having hundreds of migrations. Some of the Datical customers we have, their very first production push involved 700, 800, 900 little migrations. And what becomes challenging is you get to prod with an immutable artifact. You have these small atomic changes. You're tracking as a first-class citizen in source code control all these little migrations. But then if someone needs to do some troubleshooting or debugging, they're like, hey, so something's wrong. What's this table supposed to look like? That starts to become a very difficult question to answer because you've got all these tiny little migrations. And you're like, okay, well, 400 out of these 900, little migration scripts touch that table. And it's like you're putting a jigsaw puzzle back together to understand what that resulting state is. So they both have their pros and cons. Kind of the nirvana is being able to have a process where when you're actually tracking, versioning, and deploying the changes through the pipeline, you're doing it kind of with a set of migrations that are atomic, that are tracked, that are mutable, but you have some means to back it out into some type of a state-based model at the very end so that your ops people are not, so that whoever's doing ops, even if it's the developer doing kind of the ops work from a troubleshooting, debugging, maintenance, performance point of view, you're not like, hey, I don't know what this table's supposed to look like. I have to sift through, the last 200 migrations and understand everything that touched that table. That's also a headache. So, when you start thinking about change control, my recommendation is at least making the changes, do it as a set of ordered migrations. Over time, that's very scalable and automatable. What you're going to lose if you only stick with that approach is all of the kind of ops and state-based benefits of actually understanding the state of your database. So troubleshooting, debugging, performance start to become more troublesome. So have a means to reconcile back into that, and there are some ways to do that. And the last part is to be very, very deliberate about how and when source code control is put to use. So absolutely, strongly recommend checking database scripts into source code control. But realize very quickly that you're introducing another stateful system, source code control. And if I have something like a create table script, I've checked it into source code control. It's been deployed to 2 of my environments in my pipeline. Someone decided it was silly or bad or wrong, and they wanted to rework it. What ends up happening? Well, if you replace that change, that create table script in source code control, well, now the state of these lower environments that you've deployed to is not representative of what's in source code control. And so being very deliberate and mindful about, all right, what does source code control mean or not mean? Because if you're working with this migration-based workflow, the answer you're often going to get is, hey, always roll forward. And I think that gets back to a conversation we were having before we went on air, is if you can keep more of your environments super duper ephemeral, then it does give you the ability to kind of flush those environments, kind of destroy them and rebuild them, reprovision them, and give you the ability to rework that change in source code control. And that can be very, very powerful. All that to say, even the basics of crashing versioning and deploying changes is a more complicated problem than people might imagine it to be originally. And so change control, it's actually not trivial. And this is actually where a bulk of that process and culture change needs in, because you have to have the application developers, the DBAs, the release manager, the ops people, all these folks comfortable with what these different systems are going to mean, and how changes are going to flow, how changes are going to be reworked, and kind of how everyone's going to build trust in this new process. That was long-winded, but
okay, a lot out there, Sanjay. I gotta imagine Justin or Matt is just chomping at the bit to jump in here. Go, whoever wants to join.
At least I can speak at least on the testing side, it is a huge challenge if you have a lot of small source changes that are being pushed into production and you're not having a clear indication of what is and isn't being done. So having 1,000 small changes be pushed into production means your testing challenges. How do you know exactly what level of test that should be done against that system? And then how do you know what downstream systems are going to be impacted by those changes? Just rolling back a table create or a manipulation on a particular structure might not be an easy process, as it could impact everything in that database. You can have complete changes of the data itself and then of the aggregate tables behind the scenes. So I think having a proper source control management system, as well as a proper structure for how you limit what goes into production, is really something that has to take a lot of thought. It is probably one of the more challenging items, especially with databases, to figure out how do you determine what gets pushed, and when an issue occurs, how do you know what to remove back and roll back and fix?
Great. Are there any places you can kind of learn best practices for source control around database, particularly within DevOps? Anybody aware? Maybe this webinar is the best source. Okay, no answers on that. Well, let's jump on, move on then. One of the questions that one of our listeners, Mark, asked is the problem of having so many databases, so many types. Each seems to have its own tools, which can make it extremely complicated to compare schemas, validate the changes against database prod. They may have config drift. There's also, of course, the tools themselves more to integrate into the tool chain. What are some of the challenges and solutions to that problem? How about Justin? You want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one. So I will say this is something that I keep coming back to in my thinking on this topic as one of the just inevitable complexifiers of 2019 and beyond, is that there's not a database anymore, for sure, because it is appropriate and reasonable for application development teams to decide, like, you know what, this data is shaped like Redis, and this data is in Flight and Kafka, and this data is just in S3. And yet the totality of that, of course, is our database. And so I will say, like, it's also very true that the tools differ by each of those stores, and some of those things, like what's in memory in Redis, feels ephemeral, and yet to take a representative snapshot for simulation or testing, you still kind of have to, right? So I would say no easy answer here, other than to first acknowledge that you have to address some of these questions in each. At StrongDM, I think what we primarily deal with is creating a unified layer of access controls, at least. So at least when you think about the security, privacy, and encryption dimensions across all of those, there's sort of one way of treating them. So you can have one way of thinking about at least that dimension. How do you get to these things in a unified, rational way?
Great. Matt, thoughts?
On the query search side, this has been a challenge for us creating a testing solution that can hit almost all of the data sources that users have has been our main focus. We've found, at least with our clients, that almost no organization has one or even two sets of data sources. There's usually dozens of different technologies based off of the different groups, whether it's development teams that are making the front end or the back end teams that are working on, say, analytics and reporting. We had to create a solution that would be able to connect to everything. And that, I think, is very important when you're dealing with any DevOps solution, is you shouldn't have to have hundreds of tools that are unique for particular environments. You want a set of tools that work across the board. So if you're dealing with your databases, you want something that's going to connect to S3, it's going to connect to your Spark environment, and it's also going to connect to your more, say, legacy systems such as mainframes. And you want to have that overall compatibility. So that way, when you're writing your items, you're writing it once, and you only need one set of skill sets. You don't want to have to train people up on 40 different tools. You want to make sure that you can unify the entire process, which I think is one of the benefits of doing and dealing with DevOps, is that by unifying all of your different tool sets, you can actually speed up your process and really get everyone on board with the effort itself.
Cool. Sanjay, anything to add?
The only thing I'll say is, kind of the biggest area of feature requests we get on the Datical side is support for new platforms and new types of data stores. So I can echo everything that the other guys are saying in terms of, the diversity of platforms, the pace at which they're growing, the interfaces and tooling that some of them have. It's a challenge. I don't think there's a great answer, and it's, I think, one that a lot of the vendors are also trying to keep up with.
Very good, very good. Around this question too, we're still getting questions from the audience. Things like, let's say, when your database, how would you manage when you're deployed depends on a new database table structure going in. Another question here, similar to that, how can you keep track of changes, especially when you see database changes and are made in tandem with the applications, and who kind of is responsible for that, since they're sharing of roles? Could we take maybe that example of, so if you're rolling out a database table structure change, how would you picture that, the steps of how to include that in a DevOps process, working in that style of team? Matt or Justin, you want to start?
Well, when you're rolling out a change to a table structure, usually I would link all of the changes that are occurring to a particular application front-end change. So you would want to keep your application code, your database change, your test cases all in line with each other. So that's where it's very important for all of those items and decisions to be made early on. So that way, when you're doing a deployment, you don't have to worry about miscommunications or things getting out of sync. And by keeping them all in sync with each other, the application code changes, the database changes, and your test cases, you can roll back those particular items if an issue does occur. The challenge with that is you do need a solution that's able to hold the state of your database. You do need a solution that's going to be able to hold the state of your test cases as well, to make sure that any of those manipulations can be rolled back in sync. So it's very important to have that holistic view when you're doing a deployment, that it's not just going to be changes to the database that are important. It's going to be changes that are going to impact your source code. It's going to be changes that are going to impact your test cases. And then it's going to be changes on the downstream systems as well.
Great. I also want to let you know, Matt, you have one comment. It says, OMG, I agree with Matt's comments 100%. So if this was the voice, you'd have one chair turn. So good for you. Sanjay, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, if we're taking the case of some type of structure change, again, a big part of what Datical does is provide a unified approach to making database changes, regardless of the database platform, kind of through the pipeline. And we think about database changes in a couple of different ways. There are changes that are kind of not rerunnable, and there are changes that are rerunnable. The stuff that's not rerunnable often is, things like, creating or modifying kind of the structure. So if you're doing a create table, that's not a rerunnable change. Once you create it, it's that impotent. You can't go create that table again. The database is going to yell at you. So for us, a lot of what we think about when solving that kind of problem is, it is describing that change as atomically as possible. It is validating that change, so kind of understanding what it interacts with. So echoing a lot of what Matt's saying, hey, you're kind of modifying the structure. You really do need to do the work to understand what's the collateral impact here. That's always been the case with the database, right? It's like there's probably a meme. One does not simply make a database change, but because they all have consequences. So kind of understanding those consequences on the data side will help people validate some of that. But I think the other part to kind of thinking about how in a new methodology you might take something like this table create or some type of structural change and move it through is to have very well established, I'll call it agreements with the rest of the team on, okay, here's how we're going to handle any rework. If there's a need to rework this, here's how it's going to be done. And having kind of visible and understandable, I'll call it processes, so that the rework on that script isn't happening, on a DBA's laptop before you go to stage or prod, because that's often what happens. It's like someone is managing things in an Excel spreadsheet, things are being edited and managed offline, things don't always make it back to source code control is not always true. Those same problems we unpacked earlier. So again, something simple like a table change or table create, more than anything, getting started is just having really well-established processes. Here's how we're going to track it, here's how we're going to deploy it, here's how we're going to make any rework to it and kind of let everyone know what the rework is. Here's how we're going to revalidate it if we found issues and it has to go back. Here's the impact it's going to have to everything else so that we can start planning what some of the test and other effort is. And kind of have that all mapped out and not be reactionary to the workflow as we go through it.
Here's a question. I'd like you all to put your company or your product hat on for a minute for query search, data call, and strong DM. Which set of if a customer came to you and said, which set of tools do you use to deal with database deploy? I don't know if that's something all of you do or not, but how would you answer a customer who was asking you that question?
I guess easy on the Datical side, we actually help people deploy their database code changes. So I'd say
softball.
And if that's overkill for you, we have a really popular open source project, Liquibase. So if you're not ready for an enterprise class tool, start with Liquibase. And if that doesn't do enough for you, Datical's an answer.
Justin, how about you?
Sure. So, I will say that actually, just because this is still early, the most common tool that I see is definitely DIY and homegrown, and it is tailored to the application itself, and it's tailored to the particular element of the state store that I see in play. So I will. It sounds like there are the other panelists here have some great recommendations on what might become some of the standard approaches, but definitely the most common one is sort of that I see is accept that you're going to be writing some of your own code.
Always a great place to start. Usually is where you start. Matt, what are your thoughts?
I completely agree with Justin. The main one I see is Jenkins, surprisingly, is even on the database side, but a lot of homegrown solutions that are being put into place. On the testing side, usually we find that our customers or the people that are doing POCs either have absolutely no testing being done or it's manual, which is a very tedious effort on their part. So there's really not much of a solutions out on the testing side other than what query search provides overall.
And I'll actually echo the comments that these guys are making. I mean, what we find often is absolutely that it's a lot of homegrown, some folks wrote some scripts or did some things. That is like the status quo is a bunch of people who have rolled something in-house. So at a minimum, look into some of the open source projects that might bring you a level of standardization, if nothing else.
Very good. Next, we touched on security a little bit here and there throughout the conversation. Next one's kind of a curiously worded one from Laura. It says, how can you confidentially add security to your DevOps process for databases specifically? I'm not sure
Sure.
why.
So
Yeah,
I think
go ahead.
I think I've got to take this one because certainly
Okay.
that's what our product is all about: security, access controls, and auditability. And I'll say that this is as I think about how to build stuff today and going forward. There's just no way around it. Like you have to acknowledge the role of privacy, the privacy regulation is having on how we handle data, right? And then of course security, right? And so both of those topics are not going away. They're only going to get worse or better depending on your point of view. And so addressing them as just some first-class concept that you have in your pipeline. Who can handle this data? How can we prove that happened or didn't happen? I think it's a necessity of the system. And so I would say, I wish this were only a technical challenge, but because it's also a policy and regulatory challenge, I think you've got to find the technologies that can help you create a great data DevOps pipeline. And basically, it's just a great point to insert some technical solutions to some of those policy and confidentiality questions that we definitely can't ignore.
Oftentimes in testing data to test against, including who can see what, who can have access to what data in your test environment or pre-production environment is a challenge. In a DevOps world, those roles aren't necessarily, the boundaries aren't as well defined. Matt, is there any things you've come across of ways of dealing with the access control to test data and who can see what as you add security into this process, or is it kind of an untapped problem, unsolved?
It's definitely an issue, especially with GPDR and the sensitivity of the data itself. We see a lot of organizations implementing data masking policies. So when they're cloning their production database for testing purposes, they're masking all of their data sets in order to eliminate the risk of leaking confidential information. But on that side, that brings a lot of challenges on the testing aspect, as you're not dealing with production data. So it's going to act and react differently to the scripts that have been created. So it's a big challenge on the testing side to, one, generate the data that's needed to validate all of the different edge conditions, but also to make sure that you're not dealing with data that you should not be able to have access to. On the testing or audit trail side, we do see a lot of groups starting to validate that users do or do not have access to certain data sets. So having scripts that are run in production to make sure that certain user levels cannot see certain data sets, and making sure that that encryption is occurring in production as well, such as with credit card numbers or with social security numbers.
Sanjay, I know this is something you've also wrestled with, maybe in combination with deploying large data sets or across multiple clouds, distributed environments. What are some of the solutions or ideas you've come across that help with this challenge?
Yeah, so I mean, on the Datical side, some of the stuff our product helps with is managing the differences in kind of permissions and access control that you get between different environments. So we have some capabilities built into Datical to help with this. The idea being, for a variety of really good reasons, dev environments might have a very different just security stance and policy than your production system. But when it comes to actually managing quite a bit of this, we partner with folks like Delphix that help with the actual data masking or synthetic data generation. We do our part in also integrating with other, whether it's credential vaults or ITSM solutions from a change management point of view. Because again, from the database deployment point of view, it's all about, are these changes, valid? Is there a, change request that has been approved or that that you can do this change against? So a lot of it's very process based, and then also adding in for this flexibility of not every single database environment is going to be locked down the exact same way. You know, your lower environments might have a subset of data, might not have any data, might have fully synthetic data. And so being able to accommodate all of that, that's really how, you know, kind of we run into this issue. But I agree, it's one that you have to solve. You're going to do it at scale, and you're going to not get into trouble doing it.
Very good. Just want to remind our audience that we've posted an ebook into the chat area that you can download, bringing databases into the DevOps fold. Also, we're about 10 minutes left, so if you have any questions, please pop those into the questions panel. What's the role of the data architect in DevOps? And I assume data architect is someone who's thinking about the model itself and the design, the layout of the database schema, et cetera. What's that role look like in this DevOps world? Matt, you want to jump in?
I think the data architect themselves, their role is still very similar to what it is right now, just organizing and setting up how the data structure should look. It's very important for a data architect to know where your data is flowing to. So not just the small changes that are happening with your incremental releases, but the downstream systems that are being impacted from that. So that overall knowledge of the data lifecycle, and more on that, I would say that data ops side, because it's very important to note that your database is not by itself. It's usually never just your application and your database. So while your software development team might have great knowledge of these application they're developing, they might not have a lot of knowledge of those downstream systems. And it's very important for the data architect to be aware of any changes that maybe those app developers want to put into place, and to really architect that properly, so that way you don't have corruption or a loss of data by making bad changes in production.
Great. Justin, you want to jump in?
Sure. So I would say to the extent that you have hopes for actually distributing more of the ops into dev, then someone with the role architect, I would hope would spend an increasing fraction of their time on education and essentially working through those teams. So that would be my that'd be my recommendation. And then also, just because security and privacy is such a pervasive topic, if I were in those shoes, I would also probably want to take on some of that policy stuff and add it to my checklist. So in addition to making sure we're not truncating values here as we store this, we can also ask about the heritage of that and any privacy implications. And when we do have a GDPR inbound and we have to scrub something, which fields are implicated. So all of that layer of that extra layer of semantics in the model, I think having one person that really deeply feels that and then spreads it and educates it throughout the whole team.
Sanjay, I'd like you to jump in too, but I'm going to add to this. There's another question in addition to the data architect role. Who should write change automation scripts if developers are handling the database in that kind of a world? So if you can kind of think about both challenges.
Sure. Who should write the change automation scripts? Yeah. It's an interesting one. I guess on the first point on what role does the data architect play, I don't know if I have anything more to add beyond what Justin and Matt have kind of put in. The only thing I can say is often, what I see is these folks need to probably get involved a little bit earlier in the process. But outside of that, especially as you're moving to kind of a DevOps, an agile workflow, having folks that are architects be involved in kind of thinking through the design and kind of participate in that up front is going to be super important, plus a lot of the stuff that Justin called out. In terms of who should be writing these change scripts, I'm sure it's an area of debate, because when you look at teams that have kind of fully evolved to the you build it, you run it model, then often it's just a developer, and it's kind of like people lose the moniker. It's like, it's not like you're an app developer or a database developer. It's just you're a developer, and there's this push towards more generalist capabilities on the team, where you don't have a special silo of people called DBAs, or you don't have a special silo of people called, front end or application developer or what have you. But that's not always true, in the sense that not all teams are there. And so we've seen it across the spectrum. Sometimes it's DBAs writing changes. Sometimes it's app DBAs sitting on app teams that write it. Sometimes it is developers that write it. Sometimes actually the data architects and data modelers help with that stuff. Sometimes it's just tools that produce some of this. But I think what's more important than who does it is making sure that you have all of the transparency, governance, visibility, traceability, auditability, validation, and that there's a very clear understanding of, I like to call it how a bill turns into a law. So there's going to be someone who's authoring this thing, but how it goes from this idea that someone authored all the way through to it's now live on a production system, having that workflow and process figured out is more important than being like, you're the one writing it or I'm the one writing it. So that's my take on it.
Okay, wonderful. We're coming up towards the end of our webinar time here. I thought I'd close on this question to each of you. So if you were going to, from a database perspective, if you're going to sit down and have coffee or lunch with a compatriot that's a heavy DevOps person, maybe DevOps engineer, admin, developer, DevOps person, what's the one piece of advice that you would give them about how to best effectively work with folks that are coming from the database world? Justin, would you start?
Sure. So to effectively work with, I'm going to make an assumption here that you're referring to folks that in their career have spent a larger share of time just thinking about and concentrating on the database itself.
Yes, correct.
Yep. So I would say for sure there are just making sure that the on-ramp into the rest of the DevOps practices is available to that person with that expertise. So just collaborating on a small project together, and showing and illustrating, and really just getting folks' feet wet for some of the other ways that we express infrastructure and have declarative specifications of infrastructure, and just practicing together. So I think that would be the first bit of advice. Just break down the sort of skill silo so that everybody feels like they have their hands on the same kinds of tools.
Mm-hmm. Sanjay, appreciate your perspective on this.
Yeah, I think it'll probably go back to some of the comments I've been making about having a well understood process. I mean, for people coming into this space, it can be a little bit daunting, especially because as we started this whole segment, we said database DevOps is kind of in a nascent place. It has the complexity of you have all of this state that you have to worry about. So acclimatizing to this has everything to do with really understanding what the current process is, and then working together as a team or as an organization on what that future state needs to look like. And again, I think I'll echo some of the, it's true that a lot of the solutions out there in the market today are kind of homegrown or homebrewed solutions to this kind of stuff. And so whether it's looking at a local base or a Datical, or just bringing some standardization so that not having people kind of having to come into this space and learn about the few scripts that a few smart people wrote to hold everything together, and instead you have automation worrying about it, and you can worry more about who's writing that that database change and how does it get from a bill to a law, and aligning on that. But I see that as often being the hardest part, and it's got one part to do with technology, but it has so much more to do with just overall culture and process evolution than it does with any specific tech. And probably the hardest thing to get past as anyone, whether you're a new person or someone who's been on the team for a while.
Mm-hmm. Matt, how would you have that lunch conversation?
Justin and Sanjay both made great points. I think, selling the benefits of DevOps and how you can build upon the skills that your team already has. Your DBAs are coming in with a ton of skill sets, and to show them what they can now spend their time on and how they can be better integrated with the team is something that I think would easily bring them on board. showing them how much they can benefit overall and what their time savings could be.
Excellent, excellent. Well, the only thing I have to add to that conversation is just a bit of pragmatic advice is make sure you pick up the ticket, pay for lunch. All right. Well, this has been fascinating, and I can't thank all three of you enough for being on our panel today. Man, talk about a wealth of information and experience and advice. It was worth the ticket that we paid, times 1,000. So I'd like to thank our guests, our panelists today. Matt Moss, who's product manager at QuerySurge, Sanjay Chawla, who is director of product at Datacol, and Justin McCarthy, founder and CTO at Strong DM. And I'd like to thank also you, our listeners, for attending today. Thank you for the time that you spent with us. We hope everyone has a good day. Be safe out there.